Welcome to this debate this evening on absolute morality without God. I am your moderator, Reginald Finley. You can check out my website at www.infidelguy.com for we are sponsoring the debate this evening. It is September 23rd, 2005, and we have two individuals on the phone with us right now. We have Erik Wielenberg and Dr. Robert Morey. The proposition to be debated this evening: in a godless universe, there are objective, absolute moral truths that constitute universal transcendent ethical standards by which we judge the motives, thoughts, words, and deeds of ourselves and others, and which do not depend upon the knowledge, belief, or existence of humanity for their existence or validity. And that is the debate this evening. Now, Dr. Morey is hailed as being one of the primary Western voices against Islam. Erik Wielenberg is the author of the new book, Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe. The debate parameters will be a total of 90 minutes, and we're going to have a 5-minute introduction on both sides, beginning with Erik. Erik will affirm his position for 15 minutes, and Morey will rebut at the same time. Erik will then defend for 10 minutes, and Morey will rebut for also the same time. Erik will defend for 5 minutes, and Morey will rebut his defense for 5 minutes. And then there will be a 15-minute open debate with callers. And then concluding remarks will be no more than 10 minutes each side. Without further ado, please welcome Erik Wielenberg. Go ahead, Erik, and give us your introduction.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me on this show, and I wanted to thank Bob for agreeing to appear on the debate as well. So, just briefly, I teach philosophy at DePaul University, which is a 4-year small liberal arts college in central Indiana. I've been there for about 6 years. Before that, I did my graduate work at University of Massachusetts, and while I was finishing up there, I spent a year at Notre Dame. They've got sort of I guess you'd call it a philosophy of religion think tank there, so I spent a year there while I was finishing up. But, of course, what got me on the show is the book, Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe, which came out in March. So let me just say a bit, I'll try to control myself, just say a bit about the book. In philosophy, we sort of specialize, so I specialize in ethics and also the philosophy of religion. So the book deals with the intersection, I guess you would say, of those two areas. And the book kind of falls into two halves. And so in the first half, I'm mainly concerned to make the case that even if God doesn't exist, there can still be morality, real morality of these, what they sometimes call objective, universal moral truths. And in the course of doing that, I try to respond to arguments. Most of, I guess, they come typically from Christian philosophers trying to make the case that you need God to have real morality. So I try to rebut those arguments, make the case you can have real morality even without God. Second half of the book, then I turn more to the question of, if the first part is right, then what might some of these moral truths look like? And I'm particularly interested there in the virtues or moral character, I guess you would say. And so I focus on virtues that are traditionally associated with Christianity, virtues like humility, charity, hope. And there I'm asking the question, could there be atheistic versions of these virtues? So if there's no God, would there still be a virtue, humility, and what would it be like without God in the picture? So that's me.
Okay, and Bob Morey, tell us a little bit about yourself and to the listeners, please.
Well, from New York City, raised in a non-religious home. Religion was a racket. My father always said religion only had to do with money, sex, and power. So it was a racket. And I studied philosophy, got my first degree in that, and then went on to a master's in theology. Then later earned two doctorates, one in Islam, one in apologetics, and then received an honorary doctorate for some groundbreaking work on the pre-Islamic origins of Islam in pagan Arabian moon god religion. But I'm right now president of a university and seminary in Southern California, Irvine, and pastor a church. And, well, I'm working on book number 48, which is The Rise and Demise of Natural Theology, Eastern and Western. It'll deal with Eastern Orthodoxy as well as Western forms of Christendom, particularly Roman Catholicism, proving that the East followed Plato into mysticism and the West followed Aristotle into rationalism, and that's why there was, in the end, a collapse of what is called natural theology and natural law, naturalism in religious drag, and why it failed ultimately. And it'll probably end up part of the discussion we have today. So I'm just very happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay. Thank you very much. Erik Wielenberg, you have 15 minutes to provide your opening arguments.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I think why don't I start by stating the proposition so we all know what we're talking about. It's a bit lengthy, but here's the proposition. In a godless universe, there are objective, absolute moral truths that constitute universal transcendent ethical standards by which we judge the motives, thoughts, words, and deeds of ourselves and others, and which do not depend upon knowledge, belief, not depend upon the knowledge, belief, or existence of humanity for their existence or validity. Okay, so there's the proposition I've been charged with arguing in favor of. So I take it that Bob and I agree that moral truths of this sort exist, but what we disagree about is whether they require the existence of God. Bob says they do, I think, and I say they do not. In any case, I'm going to argue that reflection on the relationship between God and morality suggests that there are moral truths of this sort that are necessarily true and consequently are true whether God exists or not. So let me explain what I mean by necessarily true. I simply mean that these truths are not only true, but they must be true. It's impossible for them to be false. So to start things off, let's consider two theories about the nature of morality. So the first one is what I'll call the theistic view. And this view has it that there is an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and necessarily existent God who's the ultimate source not only of the physical universe, but also of all moral truth. And according to this view, without such an author, God, there could be no moral truths at all. So there's one view. The other view I'll call Wielenbergism, according to which there is no perfect God, but there are necessarily true moral truths. Now, both of these views have it that there are necessary truths and that something other than the physical universe exists. They differ when it comes to the nature of this other thing. So the theistic view says the other thing, aside from the physical universe, is God, whereas Wielenbergism says that it's moral truth. Okay, now, I think that there are good arguments against the theistic view, and I also think that some of these arguments show that there are necessary moral truths. Now, let me be clear about this. I'm not saying that because the theistic view is false, Wielenbergism must be true. This argument wouldn't work because there are other alternatives. So what I am saying is this. There are some arguments that suggest that the theistic view is false and also suggest that there are necessary moral truths. And to start, I'm going to give three arguments of this sort. So the first argument involves a contest. So imagine a contest in which the prize is omnipotence. And suppose it comes down to two final competitors. Now, the first competitor hopes to use the prize of omnipotence for the good of humanity, bringing peace, justice, and happiness to the entire world, whereas the second competitor hopes to use the prize for his own selfish, evil purposes. He plans to slaughter most humans and force the rest to live in excrement-filled pits where they'll work themselves to death as his slaves. Now, as it happens, let's suppose, the second guy wins and things look pretty bad. But the story has a happy ending, because the first thing the winner does with his omnipotence is to change certain ethical facts. For example, suppose that he makes it the case that the slaughter of innocents is fantastically good, that undeserved suffering is just, and service to him while knee-deep in excrement is a joyous and worthwhile activity. So when he implements his plan, all is for the best. Because he modifies the nature of morality before putting his plan into place, the plan's not evil at all. Instead, it's good and just, and everyone lives happily ever after. Now, if you're like me, this story seems crazy. And what's crazy about it is exactly the idea that there could be a being powerful enough to modify morality in the way I described. It seems to me that there's simply no amount of power that would enable someone to make slaughtering innocents, for instance, a good thing. So the story that I just told gets the relationship between power and morality backward. It implies, if the story made sense, that would mean that might makes right, that an omnipotent being could reshape morality as it sees fit. But of course, might doesn't make right. There are some moral truths that no being, no matter how powerful, could change. There are some moral truths that not even an omnipotent being could make false. Let me restate that conclusion, because it's important. I'm going to come back to it. The conclusion was there are some moral truths that even an omnipotent being could not make false. Okay, so there's one argument. Now here's the second argument, and this one involves the problem of evil. So briefly, the problem of evil is the problem of reconciling the presence of evil in the world with the existence of a perfect God, and it's a problem or a challenge for the theist. Now, the problem may not be insurmountable. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But this much seems clear. Any adequate solution to the problem is going to depend on the claim that there are moral truths that even God couldn't change. So let me explain this. To see why, consider one popular response to the problem of evil, the free will defense, which goes roughly like this. According to the free will defense, free will is a great good. But if you give people free will, some of them will misuse it, introducing evil into the world. However, free will is such a great good that its presence in the world makes the world better overall, even if it brings some evil along with it. Now, here's the crucial part of this free will defense. Because God can't get free will into the world without letting some evil in as well, God can't create the best possible world without letting in evil. But now, if we suppose that God's omnipotence gives him the power to shape morality as he sees fit, suppose that's true, well, if he had that power, he could make something else other than free will into the greatest possible good. For example, he could make the performance of robotic, unfree acts into a great good. And this great good wouldn't require the existence of evil. So if God had absolute control over morality, he'd have no excuse for letting evil into the world, and this would make the presence of evil in the world totally inexplicable, and so the problem of evil would be absolutely unsolvable. So here's the upshot of the second argument. If the theist wants to have any chance of solving the problem of evil, he'd better say that there are some moral truths that even an omnipotent being couldn't make false. Okay, so one third argument. This is the simplest of the three. So this one starts with a simple premise that some things are intrinsically good. That is to say, they're good in and of themselves or good in their own nature. Their goodness is not derived from any external source. So here's one possible example. Consider falling in love. Seems to me this is an intrinsic good in and of itself. But if there are intrinsic goods like this, then their goodness isn't derived from God because God would be an external source. So it doesn't take God to make falling in love good. It's good in its own nature just because of the sort of thing that it is. And so this third argument, I think, shows that there are some moral truths, like love is intrinsically good, whose truth is independent of God. Okay, now, if these arguments work, it follows that there are moral truths that not even an omnipotent God could make false. Now, this can be puzzling. How could this be? Can't an omnipotent being do absolutely anything? Well, most theists have recognized that the answer to this question is no. There are some things that even an omnipotent being cannot do. So, for instance, theists like Thomas Aquinas, C.S. Lewis, have recognized that some things are simply undoable because they're just plain impossible. Popular example, not even an omnipotent being could create a round square. This is because it's a necessary truth that there are no round squares. They're just plain impossible. So if I'm right that some moral truths couldn't be made false even by an omnipotent being, this suggests that these moral truths are necessary truths. And if they're necessary truths, they're still true even if there's no God at all. And furthermore, these moral truths don't depend on the knowledge, belief, or existence of humanity for their truth. They're true if there's no God. They would still be true if there were no people. They're transcendent ethical standards that we can use to judge the motives, thoughts, words, and deeds of ourselves and others. Okay. Well, at this point, you're probably hankering for me to reveal one of these wondrous moral truths. So here's one. It's always morally wrong to torture the innocent just for fun. Now, I'm not saying this is some great moral breakthrough I've just given you. In fact, it's not a breakthrough at all. It's entirely obvious. But what I am saying about this moral truth is that it's necessarily true, and it's true regardless of whether God or people exist at all. And I think we can use it to judge others and ourselves. So one sort of obvious example. Another question that arises here is how we come to know these moral truths. Well, the nice thing about necessary truths is that they're often obviously true, so that if you understand the relevant concepts, you can often see that they're true just by reflecting on them. So, for instance, consider the claim that there are no round squares. I think if you understand roundness and squareness and think about them properly, you'll see that there couldn't be any round squares. The concepts involve a contradiction. In much the same way, I think that if you understand the relevant concepts and think about them properly, you'll see that torturing the innocent just for fun couldn't be morally permissible. One final thought here. Theists often rhetorically ask atheists where moral truths come from if there is no God. So, do they just magically pop into existence purely through chance? Are they somehow randomly spit out of the meaningless void? And these sorts of questions can be an effective rhetorical device, but notice the assumption that they rest on. The crucial assumption here is that all moral truths must come into existence at some point. And I think this assumption is mistaken. At least some moral truths are necessarily true, and so they don't come from anywhere. So my answer to the question, where do these necessary moral truths of yours come from, is much the same as the theist's answer to the question, where does this God of yours come from? The answer in both cases is they don't come from anywhere, they exist necessarily. So let me by way of conclusion, just review what I've said, try to keep things clear. So I gave three arguments, and these arguments were designed to show that at least some moral truths are necessarily true, and so they're true whether God exists or not. So they'd still be true in a godless universe. So the arguments were, the first one involved the imaginary contest, the second one related to the problem of evil, and the third one is based on this idea that some things like love are intrinsically good. And so I think that arguments like this, they teach us that the theistic view that I described at the beginning is false, because they teach us that some moral truths are true even if God does not exist. And they also teach us that some moral truths are necessarily true. Such truths lie at the very bedrock of reality. They're created by no one, and they're under no one's control. They're absolute, objective, transcendent ethical standards that we can come to know and can use to judge the thoughts, words, and deeds of ourselves and others. I think with that, I realize I haven't used up my full 15 minutes, but I think I'll stop right there with those three arguments, at least at the outset, and I'm happy to turn things over to Bob.
Okay, Erik, to let you know that you had another 3 minutes on that, so if you ever want to reclaim those, I'll allow you to do so.
Sounds good.
All right, Bob Morey.
In the godless universe that Erik describes in his book, and I've got a hold of every article that I could possibly find from you, matter, chance, and time are the only things that exist. Anything that is supernatural does not exist. Thus you boldly assert on page 2, quote, no supernatural entities exist, nor have such entities existed in the past, nor will they in the future, end quote. Of course, this would mean you'd have to become a supernatural entity in order to make such a universal negative verifiable, because you'd have to be eternal, omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent in order to verify that no supernatural entities ever existed in the past, exist in the present, or will exist in the future. But we're not dealing with the issue of epistemology at this point. We're dealing with your view of ethics. We can save a discussion of common logical fallacies that I discovered in your work later. My discussion will be in two parts. Number one, the self-refuting nature of naturalism. Any worldview that successfully reduces itself to irrational forces or causes, such as dumb luck and brain chemistry, is self-refuting. On page 129, we read this. In a naturalistic universe, it is a person's physical states, particularly the states of the brain and nervous system, that are responsible for mental activity, end quote. In other words, the ideas running around in my brain and in your brain are produced by chance-driven firing of electrical charges along the synapses of the brain, which one materialist that I debated not too long ago on ABC called brain farts. Your ideas are no more rational than a fart. They are results of such irrational forces as the physical state of your brain and nervous system. On page 111, every thought we think takes place within a framework not of our own making, end quote. Now, a naturalist must give a naturalistic or material explanation of belief in supernatural entities. Why do the majority of people persist in believing in gods, goddesses, ghosties and ghoulies and spirits and demons and things that go bump in the night? Why do they continue to believe in things that are beyond nature? Well, on page 129, we read, if naturalism is true, then human beings are part of the natural world and consequently can be understood using the methods of science. One benefit of abandoning the myth of a non-physical soul that is the true self, and it is responsible for our mental activity, is an increased understanding of how the brain works and how it is responsible for our mental states. Now, Erik has no problem using this paradigm to explain why the majority of human beings believe in some sort of supernatural entities. People believe in supernatural entities because their brains are wired that way. On page 158, we read, we are to some extent hardwired for religion. And then you refer to a couple of authors, one of whom I've debated on, as I said, on radio. Some naturalists have claimed that they've actually discovered that part of the brain where the idea of God, gods, goddesses, ghosties, ghoulies, things that are supernatural, where these ideas are chemically generated, where they bubble up through brain chemistry. Since belief in supernatural entities can be traced back to chance-driven, irrational physical causes such as brain chemistry, these ideas are inherently irrational. Since belief in God is the result of brain chemistry, some naturalists have suggested that science should discover some way, chemically or by surgery, to alter the brain, to erase that part of the brain where the idea of supernatural entities keeps bubbling up. Erik seems to entertain such ideas when on page 135 he refers to brain modification. Then on page 139, quote, my proposal is that science can help us become morally better. Or again, page 140, we ought to focus our efforts now on using science to master the heart of darkness within us, end quote. And then you conclude the book by saying, quote, I have recommended putting science to use in the Platonic quest for a reliable way of making people virtuous, end quote, page 160. Now, the Yahudim get very nervous when we hear Germans talking about science making people anything, and particularly when we hear making people virtuous. And it would seem clear from his book that his vision of a virtuous society would mean there would be no room for belief in God, that atheism is certainly more virtuous than theism. Thus, atheism is a virtue while theism is a vice, so science can be put to work to eradicate theism, the belief in supernatural entities of some sort. And this, of course, would mean we wave goodbye to free will and say hello to George Orwell's robotic society of social engineering. The problem with this whole approach of basing everything upon matter, chance, and time, and saying there's really nothing beyond that, is that it's a sword that cuts both ways. Where do the ideas of naturalism, materialism, atheism, agnosticism, etc., where do they come from? And most important of all, where does Erik's idea of something he calls objective moral truths in a godless universe, where do they come from? They, too, are nothing more than brain farts. They are just as chemically based as theism, and thus ultimately are nothing more than a combination of matter, chance, and time. Perhaps brain modification through surgery or medication is needed to alter the part of the brain where ideas of atheism and naturalism are chemically produced. Brain modification techniques can be used to rewire the defective brains of atheists so that they, too, would believe in God automatically without any problem. Perhaps a pill a day will keep atheism away. Now, Erik's idea of objective, absolute moral truths is itself the product of chance-driven chemical secretions and electrical charges in the synapses of the brain, and hence hopelessly irrational in origin and quite meaningless. Part 2, Erik's objective moral absolute truths function in his system in the place of God in the Christian system. Several illustrations, I think, will demonstrate this. Number one, in the Christian world, God judges our motives, thoughts, words, and deeds. In Erik's world, his so-called moral truths, quote untruth, judge our motives, thoughts, words, and deeds. Number two, in the Christian world, we can judge other people's motives, thoughts, words, and deeds. And in Erik's world, just as well, we can judge other people, and we can judge their thoughts, their words, and their deeds by his so-called moral absolutes. In the end, we are still being judged by someone or something outside of us, above us, and superior to us, and hence we are no longer free. Number three, in the Christian world, God determines our fate. In Erik's world, chance determines our fate. Either way, someone or something rules our lives, and thus we are not the captain of our own fate. 4, in the Christian world, good and evil are attributed to God. Like Job said, have we received good from God? Shall we not also receive evil? But on pages 109 and following, Erik invokes blind chance as his version of the God of the gaps. If something good happens to you, it's dumb luck. If something bad happens, it's bad luck. Now, luck and chance are blind. They are not following a predetermined path. And in his version of humility, it's the recognition that anything that you might accomplish, anything that you might do, in reality, just mean you got lucky. So Erik wrote a book, and it was lucky that it got printed. It was lucky that it was dumb luck that he got his degree, and it's luck that he's teaching, and it's luck that we're on the program. And the God of the gaps that explains all, that does all, is chance. So, of course, chance cannot explain all and do all. There are limitations when it comes to statistical studies dealing with the issue of chance. Then number 5, in the Christian world, God exists, but not in a material way. You can't go weigh and measure God. His existence is defined in a supernatural, metaphysical way. Well, when you ask the question, how does these so-called moral truths, they're objective, they're transcendent, they're eternal, how do they exist? Well, lo and behold, they don't exist in a material way. You can't go get one. You can't ask for a pound of morality at the local ethics store. But instead, their existence is some kind of ethereal, metaphysical way. So I submit in this part 2 that Erik's version of these objective, absolute moral truths, they are simply God functioning in his system in the place of the Christian God. So if I was once again back in my atheist mood, because the only thing given, of course, in this discussion, we're beginning from a godless universe. That's the thesis. That's the given, in a godless universe. So God is written out, he's redefined, he's off the board. What we must understand in such a universe where all there is matter, chance, and time, all that exists is matter, chance, and time, then all we can say is that what is, is. Now, the attempt to squeeze an ought from an is has been tried by higher IQs and all of us combined together down through the history of philosophy. Can you get morality from matter? Can you get ethics from a rock? If you put your ear up to a tree trunk, will it really give you any ethical standards? Can you get ethics and morality from what is, an ought from an is? Well, it has ended in a complete failure. It cannot be done. I personally, having read the material, feel that Erik's so-called moral truths are only the product of brain farts, dumb luck, and an underdeveloped brain. Now, as to his presentation, it is very important in dealing with the subject of debate, and I have taught a course on debate, that you do not assume what your opponent does or does not believe. The first three letters of the word assume indicates what you become. You become an ass. I do not accept the idea that there are absolute moral truths out there floating in the stratosphere. I do not accept the idea, speaking in the context of a godless universe, from that perspective. I reject the idea of necessary truth, obviously true, intuition, intuitively true, self-evident, universal. These are all cliches of Western white European people who are hopelessly lost in the flow of history and a failure to understand that if you go to the East and you deal with Buddhism and you deal with Hinduism, what the Western person says is a necessary truth, obviously true, is neither of those things to the majority of human beings that have ever lived. Your education has been among the Roman Catholics at Notre Dame who teach what is called natural theology. And through Thomas Aquinas, there has been various philosophic dogmas that have been taught, and it's assumed that they are true simply by repetition. The idea that Western concepts of morality are universal, self-evident, intuitive, and necessary simply are false. They are culturally conditioned. They, as I said, are simply perpetuated by a bunch of white Western guys sitting comfortably in a university and not understanding that the rest of the world, by and large, never heard of those things and did not accept them. I'll give you one example. I was chosen by Yale University in the 10th grade to take non-Euclidean geometry, school mathematics study group, in which we learn sides of a triangle are ultimately parallel. All parallel lines ultimately intersect. And I was taught that Newtonian geometry and the typical trigonometry taught in high school and college, sides of a triangle are never parallel, etc., that those are all false. What one generation considers necessarily true, obviously true, intuitively true, are culturally conditioned, and the next generation will come along and say, phooey on that. Einstein canceled Isaac Newton's mechanical vision of the world.
Okay, Bob, the 15 minutes is up.
All right.
Thank you very much. Erik, time for you to defend your position. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, let me first observe that Bob offered no responses to the three arguments I gave at the outset. Perhaps that will come later. I understand. I think we both had prepared open remarks. I'm sure he wanted to get his points in. But, I mean, in the end, there was nothing there that touched really on any of the three arguments I gave. So let me try to go through some of the points that he made and address them. There was a preliminary point. There's an argument you'll hear quite a bit, which goes something like this. In order to, let me back up, he observed that early in my book I was describing naturals, and I said, according to his view, there are no supernatural entities, haven't been in the past, haven't been in the future. course, I also make clear in the book that the book contains no arguments for naturalism. The overall project is, let's suppose it's true and see what would follow about ethics. But Bob mentions an argument you'll often hear that to know something like naturalism, you'd have to be supernatural yourself. I mean, it often goes like this. To know that God doesn't exist, you'd have to yourself observe all points in space and time. So you'd have to be omniscient, omnipotent, and so on. And so you'd be God. But, I mean, that argument is simply no good. Bob mentioned lessons on logical fallacies. We can start with this one. Here's an argument that proves that it's easy to show that something doesn't exist. Suppose that we were wondering whether there was an omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing being whose overriding goal was to prevent this debate from ever occurring. Well, it's clear that if such a being existed, it would have the power, wisdom, and overriding will to prevent the debate from occurring, and so it wouldn't occur. So the fact that the debate is occurring proves decisively that no such being exists. So there's no logical fallacy involved in knowing that something doesn't exist. Perfectly possible. And of course, the argument I just gave parallels the problem of evil, at least one version of it, according to which the idea is if an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfect God existed, it would have an overriding desire to prevent evil, in which case evil would not exist, so the presence of evil shows that no such God exists. So now whether that argument works or not is a separate issue, but this sort of silly point that you can't prove a negative is clearly false. Okay, so let me discuss Bob's two main points, the self-refuting nature of naturalism. Let me start by saying a bit about naturalism as I conceive it. Bob describes naturalism as this view that everything comes from matter, chance, and time alone. Well, that's not my view, and I describe how I understand naturalism in my book. Bob seems to characterize naturalism as just a purely physical universe, and everything is produced by chance. Well, that's not my view. He says on naturalism, it's self-refuting, self-defeating, because all of our thoughts would be produced by physical processes, and so they would be, as he puts it eloquently, it is a nice touch, brain farts, and so they would be meaningless or false or something like that. But of course, this seems based on a basic misunderstanding of what science tells us, which is not that, it's not the case everything is produced by chance. It's a law-governed universe. And so we have these organized systems which can respond to the environment, form beliefs, perceive the environment, and so on. So I don't see the force of the idea that naturalism would be self-refuting, because it seems based on this false conception that in a naturalistic universe everything would just sort of happen randomly in a chance. That's not the case. I mean, science tells us that's not the case, certainly not in my view. Okay, and then we come to, Bob mentions my discussion of brain modification in the book. Let me start by saying this is surely one of the wilder sections of the book, that's for sure. However, the things I say there come nowhere near the things that Bob was attributing to me, so let me clear up some serious misunderstandings there. I do mention this idea that we're hardwired for religion, and some, not myself, others have done research suggesting there's this God spot, which when properly activated produces religious experiences, and others have suggested that perhaps this could account for the widespread belief of religion, or widespread religious belief. Now, I think Bob suggested that I was trying to use this as a premise in an argument designed against the rationality of religious belief, but I gave no such argument. So I never said that because we could locate the source of these beliefs in the brain, that they must just be brain farts or false. It's just inaccurate. I never made any such claim. And in fact, I wouldn't make such a claim because it seems false. The mere fact that something has its origin in the brain in no way entails that it's false or meaningless. And of course, this is silly, and it clearly would be at odds with my own view, which is that our beliefs and everything are produced by the brain, and of course, we can see that they're perfectly meaningful. Bob went on to suggest that I thought that atheism was a virtue and theism was a vice, and that somehow I was suggesting that brain modification should be used to take out this God spot and turn everybody into atheists. And this is where he made his not-so-subtle allusion to the Nazis. Well, the allusion would be fair if I had said anything remotely approaching such a claim, but of course I didn't. This has no basis in the book. I said no such thing. let me explain briefly what I did say with this brain modification. The brain modification relates to the phenomenon of weakness of will. And weakness of will occurs when you know that all things considered you should perform a certain course of action, but you're overwhelmed by some sort of passion and you do something else instead. And this phenomenon has been widely recognized and discussed by ethical philosophers throughout history, by Christian philosophers, by Paul the Apostle. He seems to be talking about weakness of will when he says, the good that I would do, I don't do, but the evil that I would not do or will not to do, I do. So the brain modification came up in connection with this, and the suggestion was, and this is drawing on some work in neuroscience that I discuss in the book, that science might be used to help rid us of this problem of weakness of will. Bob mentions Orwell and draws up this horrifying image of the government modifying people's brains to be virtuous, shape them the way that they want. As Bob knows or should know, having read the book, in the book I myself bring up Brave New World. I make it clear that this is something that the government would have no role in. So this sort of horrifying vision that Bob conjures up has no relation to my own view, and in fact it's something I repudiate explicitly myself in the book. Okay. Let's see, on to the second main point. Now much of that actually is pretty accurate. I think it is a reasonable way of thinking of my view is that in the place of God, you have these moral truths. Now, of course, they don't have all the same properties as God. God is a personal being, an agent. Moral truths have are not an agent or anything. They're simply these facts. Again, Bob suggested that, in my view, chance does everything. That's not the case. What I was getting at in the discussion from which he quoted and to which he alluded is simply the idea that factors beyond our control, and in a godless universe, these would be factors really under no being's control. In a universe with God, presumably they would be under God's control, but it seems clear, God or no God, factors beyond our control have a large influence on our fate and our destiny, the shape of our lives. And it's not hard to think of examples of this. If you think of the influence of your schools, where you were raised, the people you met, your wife, and then you just think of all the factors beyond your control that led to those various things occurring. I think you can see the point that I'm getting at. We do have some control over our lives, of course. We have free will. We can make decisions. So it's not this sort of all chance. It's a combination. But the point is it's important to recognize the role that factors outside of our control do play. Then later on, Bob mentioned the mistake of trying to get an ought from an is. He seemed to, despite the fact that in my opening statement I explained, I gave a response to this rhetorical question, where do these ethical truths come from? Bob makes it sound as if I think they're somehow spit out of this randomly controlled physical system.
2 minutes.
Not the case at all, thanks. Not the case. Again, I'm not trying to get an ought from an is. My point is the fundamental oughts, these moral principles or moral truths, exist necessarily. They don't come from anywhere. So they're not, they have no origin in any descriptive fact. And so this fallacy, which I agree is a fallacy of trying to get an ought from an is, it's not something I'm doing at all. So again, we have a mischaracterization of my view. The final section was sort of an interesting, I don't know what you would call it, attack on Western philosophy. Well, fair enough. Western philosophy and philosophical traditions in general have their critics. But what was notably absent was any argument or reason for rejecting my position or any of the arguments that I gave. We had some name-calling and some sort of disparaging labeling, but of course that's no substitute for reasoned argument. So, overall I would say that most of what Bob said was based on mischaracterizations of my view. I tried to clear some of these things up, but more importantly, nothing he said addressed the three arguments that I gave at the beginning, which, again, those are designed to show that there are going to be moral truths that no being, no matter how powerful, can change, and that suggests that they're necessarily true. We haven't heard anything really that addresses those arguments or tells against the view that I've given. So I think with that I'll stop.
Okay, perfect. All right. Dr. Bob Morey, and I apologize for earlier not giving you your 2-minute warning. I forgot. I'm sorry about that, but
Okay,
I'll
problem.
definitely give you your 2-minute warning this time, and also 1-minute warnings at the 5-minute segment. Okay, go ahead.
All right. I will not respond to any irrelevant arguments that are based upon a theistically viewed universe, because the debate has to do with beginning with the assumption of a godless universe. So any discussions of God and what God can or cannot do are irrelevant to this discussion. When at the beginning of your book, Erik, you say no supernatural entities exist, period, you begin with that as the given, capital G, which is in philosophy. You have a right to begin wherever you want to begin. Then you go on page 110 and make statements, there but for dumb luck go I, and you state, in a naturalistic universe, each of us should recognize the tremendous contribution dumb luck has made to all human accomplishments, and that in the case of any such accomplishments, the majority of the credit goes to blind chance. A far greater contribution was made by factors beyond our control. The concept of a completely self-made individual is a ridiculous fantasy. Once you say, I'm beginning with the assumption, there never has been, is not now, and will ever be, any supernatural entities, and that's my beginning assumption. I'm not going to prove it. I'm just going to assert it and go on. This means that the only thing left are natural entities. In this case, in your book, you have described matter. I see that you clearly believe in a material universe. I see that you believe in time, and you clearly believe in blind chance. No one's guiding matter, time, and chance. Everything that is a mixture of these three things, and whatever you're going to try to come up with, including ideas, including truth itself, including the very idea that we can discuss the idea of truth. All of these things are firing of sparkles along the synapses of the brain. That Western philosophy, particularly Roman Catholic natural theology, Notre Dame and all the rest, have arrogantly claimed racist ideas that this idea is a necessary truth, it's universal, self-evident. I've heard all of these things. These are little Western European cliches that don't fly the test of history. If we looked at ancient cultures that had no contact with Christianity, you would not find the concept of creation ex nihilo. You would not find the concept of the fallen nature of man. And, from my research, you evidently were raised Lutheran as far as I can tell. I married in a Lutheran church. And this is where you've left Lutheranism, but Lutheranism has not left you when you make a statement, the greatest challenge we face is the dark heart within ourselves. I'm sure you meant that metaphorically, but I'm sure there's some atheist callers who might take a contradiction to the fact that you still carry the concept that we have a dark heart, we have an enemy within. Western ideas of virtue, once you look at the history of mankind, are not self-evident, universal, transcendent, supratemporal, supracultural. They are limited and culturally defined and culturally bound. Speaking in the perspective of being a godless, secular person who believes that even our discussion that we're doing right now has to do with the synapses of the brain and chemistry, I don't see how, in a postmodern world, you can continue to uphold medieval Roman Catholic concepts of virtue that came out of Plato and Aristotle, particularly the Greek philosophers. How can you do this? What is the justification? I do not find that your discussions of why God failed you, and you, rightfully so, in your book, become autobiographical, and I'd say about half of your book is not to the point. That is, you're explaining why you're no longer a Christian, your psychological reasons for leaving and things of this nature, but that's irrelevant. What I wanted to see was a positive, step-by-step, beginning from what is matter, chance, or just say dumb luck, matter, dumb luck, and time. Where do you come up with these wonderful things that judge us and are over us? Speaking from my own experience as a godless, secular person, I never saw them, so they're not self-evident to me. They were never evident to my father, who mocked them. Where do they come from? On what basis do you have them? I don't see how or why. One man's virtue is another man's vice. And in my discussions with many atheists and agnostics, they have usually become quite strong that they are the captain of their own fate. Instead, we are told that blind chance is the captain. We are told by atheism, no one has the right to judge you. You judge yourself. But now all of a sudden we're back to other people judging us. You have left Christianity, but Christianity is still deeply rooted within you, and your attempt to retain Christian virtues is a testimony to the fact that you can't live without them. This is the struggle that you face, and I understand it. And I'm not ridiculing or ad hominem or labeling. This is just reality. When I say Jews become very nervous when we read about social engineering, brain alteration, and you know as well as I do those authors who do speak of altering the brain, so that theism is no longer a problem that needs to be overcome. So there are those who say that. I just needed to see where you are, because evidently you have some concept, not of the state. I will correct you on that in closing. I never said that you said the state should step in. What you said was science, not the state. Science should make some way, I don't know, chemically, this is a question for you, or through brain surgery or through a drug, to make people virtuous. So I leave you with this question, what in the world did you mean when you repeatedly said science can make people virtuous, and they should figure out some way to do it? Did you mean a pill? Did you mean surgery? Did you mean conditioning? What did you mean? That's my question, and I leave you with that.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Bob Morey. Actually, you have a minute there remaining if you want to recoup that later. Okay, Erik Wielenberg, you now have a 5-minute defense.
Okay, thanks. So, again, the first and really the most important point I have to make is that we've heard absolutely nothing against the arguments I gave at the outset. Bob offers a kind of excuse of why he simply is ignoring the opening remarks, which is based on either a misunderstanding or a ridiculous notion of the parameters of the debate. He seems to think that because the proposition contains the words godless universe, that it's off limits to mention God or bring God into the picture. This is just silly. I have no idea why why that would seem reasonable. So again, Bob, it's becoming increasingly clear he's simply not going to address my arguments, which is a shame. Instead, he wants to continue to talk about the brain modification and mischaracterize my views in various ways, rather than sort of going through all of this and trying to clear up the confusions. I encourage people to actually read the book, but I guess I can't resist a couple of points. I mean, one just sort of silly example. Bob suggests that half the book is some sort of psychological story about myself. If you go to Amazon, look at the table of contents and the page numbers, this psychological discussion takes place in the introduction. You can see for yourself. It's nowhere near half of the book. Let's talk about, back to matter, time, and chance. So Bob continues to insist that I'm committed to this view that everything that exists is somehow spit out by matter, time, and chance. Again, there's no reason to accept that. It's not my view, as I've explained. We know, science tells us, part of the natural world are laws of nature. So we've got order, not just sort of matter, time, and chance. Let's see what else. Again, we have this sort of tirade against Western philosophy and culture with no arguments, just sort of describing, pointing out that he uses the word, it doesn't fly the test of history. I don't know what that means. I guess it means not everyone agrees with it. True enough. He questions the idea of sort of necessary, obvious truths. One point I think is worth making, this connection is if there aren't any necessary or at least obvious truths, we're not going to be able to know anything. You've got to start with premises. You've got to start with premises that themselves cannot be proven. So if Bob thinks that there aren't any truths that are self-evident or obvious, it's unclear how he thinks we can know anything at all. And so my suggestion is that it's perfectly acceptable and reasonable to start with certain moral claims as self-evident, obvious truths. Let's take the particular example I mentioned in my opening remarks, which is that it's morally wrong to torture the innocent just for fun. Now, I don't know whether there's been a culture or a person who disagreed with that statement. I don't really care. It seems entirely irrelevant. If Bob wants to suggest that there are no necessary or obvious truths, I take it his view is that we can't be sure that it's morally wrong to torture the innocent just for fun, and I leave it to the audience to decide whether that's a reasonable position to take. Let's see, we have this sort of amateurish psychoanalyzing of Wielenberg, God has failed me and such. Again, I think, it's silly, it's beside the point, has nothing to do with anything. I suggest people read the book to see to what, what's said psychologically there. He mentions the dark heart, the term that I do use, and suggests it has a Lutheran origin. But when I talk about the dark heart, I'm really talking about, again, it's related to this phenomenon of the weakness of will, just the point that there are these passions and desires that sometimes overwhelm us and cause us to do things that we regret later or, even at the time know that we shouldn't do. And while it may be true that in Christianity or certain branches of Christianity focus on this idea, its origin hardly is unique. It comes from Christianity. Again, it's something that Aristotle, Plato talked about long before Christianity was on the scene. So there's no sort of, Lutheran hangover that I'm suffering from, or at least I don't think the dark heart comment shows that I've gotten such a hangover. So finally he asked about what do I mean when I say science can make people virtuous? Well, again, as I say in the book, the idea is it can help us, this weakness of will. And as I said before, this is clearly the most speculative part of the book. And the idea, it would be some sort of brain modification. I don't know how. But again, the idea that we would have people just imposing this on others is not the idea. It would be a tool rough in the same family as things like, the nicotine patch. These things help us master our own emotions. That's the sort of project I had in mind. Again, not this sort of horrific surgery making everybody atheists or anything of that sort. But my main point is we've heard nothing that tells against my view or against the arguments I gave at the beginning. So I'll stop there.
Okay. All right, Bob Morey, 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. In any debate, when you have a thesis that is agreed upon by both sides, in this case, in a godless universe, and we both agreed that we would discuss, given the premise that we're living in the universe that atheists envision, a godless, no supernatural entities, no ghosties, no ghoulies, no spirits, no demons, no devils. This is something that both Erik and I agree upon. So in his book, he says no such supernatural entities exist. Well, what are you left with? When I stated that philosophically naturalism has always said matter, chance, and time, he's saying there's something else that exists outside of those things, but at the same time he mentions laws of nature. Well, the word nature, of course, takes us back to matter, And you are dealing with a combination of matter, chance, and time. If he is saying that there are these supernatural entities that are eternal, moral truths that have their own existence apart from and independent of matter, chance, and time, then they are gods or goddesses of some kind. But I don't really think he wants to say that. They are part of nature, part of the world in which we live. Now, I will not deal with the problem of evil. That was a red herring. Your three arguments are actually other debates. And if you wish to debate the problem of evil, I'm more than willing to do that. Are you willing to debate whether or not God solves the problem of evil? That's another debate, but we're beginning from the premise in a godless universe. So I'm speaking with the assumption that we are living in a universe where God does not exist. And if that's the case, then given postmodernism and where we are today, we recognize that cultural imperialism, we recognize that Western European white people have redefined things and then tried to impose it upon other cultures. You have one natural theologian who was asked, after he said that his views were universal, self-evident, intuitive, and he was said, well, what about the Hottentots? And he said, well, when it comes to the third world, they are savages and they don't count. Well, this kind of racial superiority has to be called. In a godless universe, why should the white European man be given more credence than a black man or a yellow man? So that in terms of the history of ideas, you will not find Western ideals of morality entrenched in, we don't have the time, but in the Mayan, Central America, South America, and the African and the Oriental, you will not find many of the things that he wants to claim as universal are not universal. And then lastly, when you talk about having a patch that would help you to be a virtuous person, you are assuring us that nobody would put it on you. It's voluntary. We do appreciate that, Eric, that it would be a voluntary brain modification through chemistry. But there are immense ethical issues. Is virtue virtuous if it is chemically produced by a patch and not something that you develop through character? There's an immense problem there. So, no, I'm not going to go off in tangents, red herring trails, things of that nature. You've mentioned things that are legitimate issues of other debates. The debate is in a godless universe where there is no God, no supernatural entity. All you have are natural entities of matter, chance, and time. And I don't care how you want to weave them together. In the end, that's all you have, unless you're going to have these so-called moral truths as supranatural entities. So I have to leave it there. If these entities are supernatural, well, then we're back to square one. We're back to God's, and this is where you seem to agree with me. They do function at least as God. Well, that's not good enough for me in a godless universe. I want to root out every vestigial organ of theism, including the idea that there's anything above and beyond matter, chance, and time that judges me and determines my fate.
Okay.
That's it.
All right, thank you. At this time, gentlemen, what I would like to do, it seems like both of you are quite disappointed, I think, in each other's arguments at this point. So if you guys allow it, I would like to have both of you maybe do a crossfire for about 10 minutes, just back and forth, doing some dialogue so we can really get down to the points and address issues that need to be addressed. I don't feel like the points are getting addressed like they need to. Is that okay with both of you? Can we do a little bit
sure.
of...
Yeah.
Fine with me.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
I have
All right.
some questions. I'm more than free to ask, and Eric, I'm sure, is more than comfortable to answer.
Okay, good. Excellent. Okay, we'll begin with Eric. Go ahead.
Okay, well, let me just, if I could respond to, again, this interesting reason why Bob is saying he won't address any of my arguments. He calls one a red herring because it somehow, relates to the problem of evil. But of course, the argument wasn't, the problem of evil itself, solve it, which would be another debate. That's not the argument at all. So again, he seems to have this idea that because of the proposition says in a godless universe there are ethical truths of such and such a nature, therefore it follows from that it's illegitimate to mention God. Again, it's silliness. If even if we're supposing there is no God, it's perfectly legitimate to say, okay, let's assume in the actual world there is no God. Nevertheless, we can think about what would be the case if God didn't exist, and we can draw conclusions from that. And in some cases, we can draw conclusions about the actual world, as I've done in my arguments. This is no more illegitimate or mysterious than, imagining, okay, suppose I were being speared by a unicorn right now, would I survive? And we can see clearly the answer is no. This doesn't, require that we think there actually are unicorns. So, again, this point about this reason for not addressing the arguments holds no water. So, maybe I should it's been a while since.
Now, do I respond each point?
Sure, go ahead.
Yep, back and forth.
Okay, a red herring simply means bringing up something that's not included in the debate thesis. And godless, unless I mistake the English language, means no God. We're beginning with the assumption that we're in a universe where we don't have to worry about gods and angels and demons and ghosties and ghoulies and things that go bump in the middle of the night. That's where you begin. You don't try to prove this, and you very honest, you said, I'm beginning with that assumption. Is this not the case?
Yeah, that's right.
All right. But in beginning this debate, as I prepared for it, I said, I will prepare for this debate as someone who lives in a secular, naturalistic, materialistic world where God is no longer an issue. There is no need for that hypothesis.
Yeah, let me jump in. Again, this it's very bizarre. Just because we're, let's suppose there is no God, therefore we're not allowed to mention God, and God is to be all this. Anything remotely like God isn't allowed. There's no basis for that, right? Even if we assume we're in a universe with no unicorns, which seems to be a reasonable assumption,
why would
we can still talk about what would be the case if unicorns did exist. So, this idea that the proposition of the debate rules out addressing my arguments, it holds no water.
Well, we have a disagreement. If the debate is on X and you bring in Z, I'm not going to follow a discussion about God when it's a godless premise. I'm assuming with you, I'm stepping in your shoes. I'm assuming the atheist perspective for the purposes of this debate.
Well, you're not assuming my atheist perspective. You're assuming some silly caricature. You mentioned that I was engaging in another debate. It's very easy to refute your opponent when you just pretend he holds some silly view that he doesn't hold. So again, if you...
Well, what exists beyond matter, chance, and time, or the combination of said things? Do you have any supernatural entities in the universe?
I said right at the outset, I described this view that I called Wielenbergism, which says, in addition to the physical universe, which I guess would contain those things you mentioned and some other stuff, there are necessarily true moral truths. Now,
do they exist?
Yes, they exist.
It's not a material existence.
No, it's an abstract, non-physical object. So it's considered something, here's another example, possible example.
Like an illusion?
No, not like an illusion. Here's an example, like the number 5, abstract object, not a physical thing, yet it's as real as this chair that I'm sitting on. So, again, it's in the opening section of my book, as you know, I describe naturalism. Naturalism is a much abused and a word that has given lots of different meanings. So at the beginning of my book, I try very carefully to explain what I mean by naturalism. And what I call naturalism is not what you have been calling naturalism throughout the debate.
Well, there is the traditional classic meaning of naturalism, the belief that all there is nature.
Which is why at the beginning of my book, I make clear how I'm using the word naturalism so that there isn't confusion of this sort.
Well, the only difference between you and a traditional naturalist from your book is that you believe there are absolute moral truths, whereas 99.9% of naturalists have gone on to state that there aren't. I mean, the majority of atheists that I have known and grew up with were very much like Julian Huxley was on the, I don't know, how old are you?
33.
Oh, you're okay. All right, I'm
just
old
a baby.
enough to be your dad. But anyway, I was in New York City watching a talk show, and Julian Huxley was on. And he was asked, why did English society embrace evolution so quickly? He said, because of morals. And it was David Frost said, morals? He said, yes, we wanted to get away from them as fast as possible. And so he talked about his father, and he talked about this, that, and the other. And the majority of atheists that I have met and I have known, even my own family, the very idea that there would be such a thing as absolute objective moral standards by which they're judged and they can judge other people would be so repugnant. And that's why I think you have, correctly, gave it your own name, a Wielenbergism, which is interesting, but you would have to admit, because you're a philosopher, that in the history of naturalism, the majority, the overwhelming majority have gone on to say that if all there is, you can't get a not from an is, and you've recognized you can't. So that was a statement that I simply made, and you are a variety of naturalism. That is true. But where you come up with an ought that doesn't come from is, I have yet to understand. Where do you get ought from?
So let's back up a bit. I mean, you mentioned most atheists or naturalists reject the idea of objective morality. And that may be true. I mean, it's the idea that you somehow need a God to have real morality. It's a very popular idea. Of course, that tells us nothing about whether it's true or not. And of course, I'm not an atheist of that sort, and the whole point of my book is to make the case that my type of atheism is perfectly reasonable. So again, as I think we both agree, it's going to be tricky to get an ought from an is. And it's not a matter of your IQ. It's a matter
can't.
Of what follows.
If we were doing a public debate and I brought a rock up, or even a potted plant, I did that once, and I put a potted plant. I said, now get morality out of this plant.
Yeah.
You can't do it.
Agreed. We agree on that
Neither
much.
can you get the existence of God out of a rock.
Agreed.
Out of a plant.
Right. But again, that's not what I'm doing at all. So I agree with your point, but that's simply not my project.
Are you fideistic? You're asserting the existence of these things as necessarily without, it's your faith, it's what you believe. You're giving an assertion. They exist, take it or leave it, that's all there is, baby.
No, I'm asserting that they exist, but again, I gave 3 arguments, and there are more arguments in the book, why we should think that these things exist, even without God. But there's nothing fideistic about it. It's
within the Roman Catholic world, you may discuss whether, with the Platonic influence, whether God is looking to some objective moral principles. But to someone like myself who rejects Plato and Aristotle and Roman Catholicism and natural theology and natural law, and who rejects the idea that there are these things floating around called morals, what can you say to me when I said I think it's a bunch of nonsense? It doesn't exist. You haven't proven. You've asserted it. And your argument within the circle of Roman Catholic theology may fly with a Roman Catholic or half Roman Catholic like William Lane Craig or Roman Geisler or someone like that. But with someone like myself, that won't fly at all because I don't believe in natural law. I don't believe in natural theology.
Well, look, I mean, you said I think you said it hasn't been proven or no arguments were given. But again, I mean, those 3 arguments from the beginning, those were arguments for this position.
But arguments are given in a context, right?
Well, of course. Like I said before, we've got to, you're not going to get anywhere unless you take some things as self-evident. Now, I mean, I'm not particularly worried about convincing you. I mean, it seems to me that What I'm more worried about is convincing, I guess, the public or the audience. And so, I mean, I think the way to think about it from the audience's point of view is what is a reasonable position, what is something that's reasonable to begin with.
Now, what is
and whether
reasonable,
I can convince you, I guess I'm less concerned.
Are you
about
appealing
that.
to what is called the common sense argument? What is reasonable to people, therefore it's true? What is reasonable is a psychological phenomenon. It feels reasonable. It feels good. Is that what you mean?
Let's take an example. I've mentioned two, one moral and one non-moral. So round squares.
Well, that's
right?
not morals. We're now to math.
Yeah, I know. I said I have one that's moral and one that's non-moral. This is the non-moral
one. Is
one.
this a categorical fallacy for you to use one as opposed to the other?
No. So round squares, I mean, we think about the concept roundness. We think about the concept squareness. You reflect on those concepts. You ask yourself, could there be an object that has both features, round and square? You can simply see the answer is no. If you understand those concepts.
Well, are the sides of a triangle ever parallel?
Let's stick to the round square. I mean, the kind of argument can be given. A round square would have...
In a multi-dimensional universe, isn't it conceivable that there could be round squares?
No. Here's what a round square would be. It would be a two-dimensional object that has four corners and also has 0 corners. 4 corners to be a square, 0 corners to be a circle. And you can simply see that they're
arbitrary definition, culturally conditioned?
I mean, again, the idea that this is just culturally conditioned and therefore what is false or is just nonsense or we can't know that it's true. I mean, silliness.
No,
so
silliness.
I think, but again, I'm not concerned about convincing you.
I have a friend who got a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where he was attempting to prove that mathematics, arithmetic, etc., was a Western European male heterosexual plot against minorities and women.
Yeah.
And that 2 plus 2 equals 4 only by convention.
Yeah.
The laws of logic are only what they are because we agree to them.
It's silly. I mean, that's ridiculous.
And people aren't getting their PhDs and books
the fact that somebody can get a PhD asserting something proves nothing about whether it's reasonable or not. So, again, I mean, it comes back to, I can see the sort of role you're playing, but it comes back to the audience, right, whether they think it's reasonable, whether they could be a round square, 2 plus 2 might not equal 4.
But see, that is a categorical fallacy, has nothing to do with so-called moral principles floating in the stratosphere.
What do you mean by a categorical fallacy?
Well, if you're dealing with math, we can take as a social convenience that with the base, you know, if you change the 10 base and you move to a 2 base and you change the base, 1 plus 1 will no longer equal 2.
Sure.
It could equal 0. So when you get into quantum mechanics, when you get into modern math, modern science, Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy, you get into the dancing of physics. You get into all of this stuff that's going on today. The old maxims, be it sides of a triangle never parallel, parallel lines never intersect, a square can never be a circle, they are no longer viewed as self-evident, universal, or necessary, only as culturally convenient because people think that way, because they've been conditioned that way. Now, you know that is the case in modern philosophy, is it not?
Is what the case?
That we have moved beyond simply assuming that what is reasonable to a Western person means automatically it's reasonable to all of humanity that has ever existed, exists now, and will ever exist.
Yeah, I don't endorse any such principle like that. I think any competent philosopher would have moved beyond that principle. That's not, I mean, I don't have any principle like that. I mean, my point is simply there are some things that we can think about and see that they're true. And if there aren't any things like that, there's not going to be knowledge at all.
So is that the case?
Yes.
Well, what's wrong with no knowledge?
Well, again...
no morals, no knowledge, no ethics, nothing.
Right.
Live as you please.
Yeah, so, again, I mean, I see the role that you're playing.
1 minute, gentlemen.
Not interested in convincing
1
you.
minute.
Again, it's the audience. So, I mean, let's go back to the moral truth I mentioned earlier, that it's always morally wrong to torture the innocent just for fun. Now, this is one I claim that it's self-evident. It's obvious. I mean, if you think about that, and you understand these concepts that are involved,
well,
you
I
can see
can
that
think
it's
of
true.
cultures where that's not obvious, and
A culture in which
where
it's
it's not.
acceptable to torture the innocent just for fun?
Well, if there's a higher aim to discover the strategy, the plan.
That's
in other
why
words, someone can always think of a way to justify anything.
That's why I said just for fun, to rule out a case like that. So if it's done for some higher purpose, it's not just for fun. Again, I said at the beginning, this is no breakthrough. It's something that I think is obvious.
But that's nothing wrong with that if that's what gets you off.
So, well, again, I think I leave it to the audience to decide what's the more reasonable position. My position is it's perfectly reasonable to take something like this as a self-evident moral axiom and go from there, and request that it be proven or shown that it's not just a result of cultural conditioning hold no water. It's a perfectly reasonable
Okay,
study.
gentlemen, that's the end of this segment. I really appreciate the exchange. Enlightened a lot of us. We have a lot of comments in the chat room going back and forth. Now, I have, if you don't mind, a few questions. Some might be in two parts for each one of you, if you don't mind at this point.
Sure.
And then we'll take calls. I'll start with Bob Morey. Bob, do you think that animals, non-human animals, are moral or have a concept of morality? Or are they moral beings, I should say? Make it simpler than that. Or do you think non-human animals are moral beings?
Oh, this is an excellent question, because in a godless universe, man is not separated from the animals. We're just, hopefully, a further developed, evolved primate. And animals do not have morals. They don't. My female dog doesn't worry about liaisons with male dogs. There's no conscience, no guilt. Animals do not have morals. And if man is only an animal, then morals is something that impedes his evolutionary development. Have you ever heard of Lord Balfour, Prime Minister of England?
No.
He wrote a tremendous book. It's referred to as the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He wrote a book, Foundations of Belief, in which he demonstrated that man's morality and aesthetic taste of beauty hinder his progress to development, and they should have been bred out of the race a long time ago. That morals and beauty, these two things, actually lead to the failure of man to do what he has to do. So, no.
Okay.
I would say if in a godless universe, we're all animals, some of us hairier than others, coming from different kinds of primates. There's no Adam, no Eve. Forget that paradigm. Some people evolved from orangutan, some from lemurs, some from chimpanzee or whoever. One professor at Columbia makes his argument.
Right.
Well, if we're animals, no. If we're all animals, then that's it. Forget morals. That's just an evolutionary bad luck that we happen to have by chance.
Right. Now, Bob, you keep saying in a godless, but also if God did exist, you also don't think animals have morals as well, either.
Now, if you want me to put on the other hat,
yes,
I would say that morality, so far as animals acting according to it, no, they don't.
Okay. Now, this is what I'm curious about. Why is it, if animals don't have a system of morality, how is it that higher mammals especially can form complex social units and they just don't go about willy-nilly killing each other?
Well, I'm not aware. Even the chimpanzee will kill and eat each other. National Geographic had a show this last week that I watched on the dark side of primates.
Well, we have cannibals in human past as well.
But what I'm saying is this: your question assumes a lot that I'm not prepared to give you. See, the word assume, you have to be very careful, as I said. But in the Christian theistic view of things, animals, plants, and things are in their own created order. Man is the head of the world, the head of creation, created to protect the world and to have a stewardship for its development, to take it from potential to actuality. So Adam was told to rake the garden and name the animals, for example. There's no day of judgment for animals. There's no heaven or hell for animals. When an animal dies, it goes back to the dirt, and that's it. So in the Judeo-Christian view, animals don't have morals because there's no accountability.
You would think. I mean, the other animals in their social group will hold them accountable. I've seen females jump on and defeat and kill a male chimpanzee who was just going around killing on some National Geographic program many, many years ago. But
well, we have to be careful of being anthropomorphic and reading human traits onto animals. We all do it with our dogs. We talk to them as if they could understand. They don't. It just we might as well be saying, wah, 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 wah. That's all your dog hears.
Okay. Well, that's another debate there.
The whole issue of whether or not animals are self-aware, the parakeet who looks in the mirror, the chimpanzee who hits a mirror because he thinks it's a challenger, that whole thing, whether or not animals ever developed a language of their own.
Yes.
Not the gorilla with sign language who was trained that way.
No.
That all has to do with animal psychology, and I'm not aware of any studies that would attempt to say that animals actually follow some kind of moral code.
Right. Well, Bob,
they don't.
Well, my point was that since these organisms, these higher social mammals, tend to get along well in social groups, that there must be some component, some mechanism biologically that allows them.
This is because, again, from the theist world, animals are simply organic, wind-up toys. They've been engineered and programmed, like my little Bichon Frise. He jumps on the bed. He goes around and around, scratching, making himself a nest. Well, now, I never taught him to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was engineered.
Okay.
It's part of the genetic code. That's all. They do it without thinking about it.
I understand. I just don't understand how can you make a distinction between the two. But let's go to Eric.
Well, it's genetic.
Okay. Eric, do you want to take a shot at that question I posited to him as well, or?
So
particularly if they're animals, why do animals have morals? Do you judge animals?
So sorry, basically the question again?
Do animals have morals or moral system? Do you think, especially the higher mammals?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have a good enough clear answer or clear view on that. I mean, it seems to me, this is a scientific question.
Eric, this is the problem I have then for you,
right?
Because you see where this is about to go, don't you? I mean, because if these morals that you talk about exist out there somewhere, then surely these animals must be affected by it as well.
Well, think of the way I think of it is we've got these moral truths, which they're not the only truths of this sort. I think there would also be mathematical truths of logic. But to be affected by these things, you've got to have a certain kind of brain, a brain that can engage in abstract reasoning of a certain type. And so, if you've got a fly or a dog or some creature that's incapable of abstract reasoning, it's no surprise that they're not going to be able to grasp or be affected, I guess you would say, by these moral principles. It's the same reason they can't do math. They just don't have the brain for it. But if a creature emerges that has the right sort of brain and can engage in abstract reasoning and grasp truths of that sort, well, they'll be able to grasp the mathematical truths, and I think they'll be able to grasp some of these moral truths as well.
Okay, well, Eric, also the second part of this is that, you seem to explain logically why morals must exist, absolutely, but yet you haven't provided any physical mechanism in reality in which you say you just assume it. Isn't that very similar to presuppositionalist apologetics for the existence of God? How are you going to assume it without any evidence? It's there, but you explained the logic about it, but what about the physical properties, the physical aspects of its existence?
Well, again, I think I'm not just assuming it, right? I have these arguments, which, again, the upshot is, look, if you think about how morality and its relationship to God, you see that when you suppose that God is the author, has ultimate control over morality, this leads to absurd consequences, and so that view should be rejected. And it leads to the conclusion that there are moral truths that even God couldn't change, and if God couldn't change them, stands to reason they must be necessarily true. Because if they didn't have that status, then God would be able to change them. So again, that's the basic, it's a philosophical argument. It's reasoning that leads us to conclude that these things exist. But there are many paths to knowledge, and reasoning is one of them. observation and physical interaction is one, but it's not the only one. And so the route to these moral truths is through reasoning, not through some sort of observation or physical interaction or something of that sort.
But cannot this concept of morality or absolute morality come about through thinking beings and yet still be absolute because it's inevitable because of our basic biology?
Well, look, I mean, in some sense, all of our beliefs are going to have an explanation, if we assume that evolution is correct. I mean, this is one of the points that Bob was making, otherwise he was drawing a further, I think, unwarranted conclusion. But, I mean, think of it this way, right? You study the human brain, and you can sometimes find out what causes you to believe certain things. So we find out there's a certain part of the brain that's associated with math or with moral reasoning or something like that. Or we figure out how the perceptual system works, and we see, okay, here are the physical causes that lead us to form these beliefs. But look, making all those discoveries shouldn't now make us doubt the truth of the things that we believe. Why not think of it this way? What we're finding out is how our brain gets knowledge. And so, I mean, again, it could be the same way with the moral truth. Sure, we might find out such and such physical causes lead to these beliefs. But what doesn't seem to follow is, therefore, these beliefs are unjustified or they're not knowledge. Why not, as we would, I think, in other cases, conclude, well, what we've discovered, what science has uncovered for us, is the process, the physical process that leads us to knowledge of these truths.
Okay. We got a first caller calling here. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, the number to call in, get ready, is 888-503-0802. We're now going to take 15 minutes to take calls, and then we'll wrap up and close at the top of the hour. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, this is Kimberly A.K. I would like to talk to Wielenberg about his example about morality. Sorry, I'm a little nervous first time calling.
Okay, no problem, Kim. Go ahead.
Okay. I think he's appealing to emotion because he says it's morally wrong to torture innocents for fun. But what would he say is it morally wrong to just go swimming just for fun? Is that morally right or wrong to just go swimming for fun?
Someone argues it's not a moral issue, but go ahead, Eric.
Seems fine to me.
Okay, then there's an element there. The difference is that there's a principle probably that you have that you're just not supposed to cause pain, because that's the difference. In one thing you're causing pain, and the other you're not.
Right.
So if you're just going to have this claim that you're not supposed to cause pain, well, in some cases pain is actually good. So you actually have this hidden proposition that you're hiding by saying it's wrong to torture innocents, I believe.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's a good question.
Very good.
I mean, there may well be another more general proposition that would, yield this truth that it's morally wrong to torture the innocent just for fun. But I guess the proposition wouldn't be it's always wrong to inflict pain, as the caller points out. I mean, that is open to numerous counterexamples. I mean, the principle, I suppose, would be something along the lines of it's wrong to inflict pain for no good reason or something like that. And if you think about how we think about morality, we use principles like this all the time, right? It's wrong to break a promise unless there's a good reason. And the idea is, what's going on is there are these actions which there's something bad about them in their nature, and unless there's some other good justification or thing that overrides that badness, then it's going to be wrong to do them. And so, I mean, I think we use these principles all the time when we're thinking about our ordinary lives, and it's perfectly reasonable to do so. There's nothing mysterious or unwarranted going on there.
All right, Bob, you can address that as well.
This really gets to the whole epistemological problem. On page 2, we read, our intuitive grasp of the sorts of entities that might reasonably be characterized as supernatural is sufficiently clear and includes the God of each of the three major monotheistic religions, as well as non-physical souls of the sort posited by Descartes and others. Naturalism entails that none of these things exist. Now listen to me carefully.
Stand by.
If you say, well, these theists over there, they have an intuitive understanding that is reasonable to them, that is clear and precise to them as to what they believe, but we believe that they're wrong, this means any view of reality based simply upon what is intuitive to you and what is reasonable to you is not automatically true. Just because something's intuitive or reasonable or sufficiently clear does not mean it's true, because in the case of theism, you say, well, I go ahead and reject it even though it is those things to them. And in this case with this is an exact point. What is wrong in a godless universe with fun? Nothing. We do a lot of things that are fun. What is wrong with torture? Nothing inherently wrong. It depends on the context, which throws us into relative situational ethics. The moment we start swimming in the waters of relativism, there are no life preservers of these universal truths for us to hang on, because the moment we try to define them, they dissolve into gas or smoke and we drown in the waters of relativism. And the young lady was exactly right. She gave an analytic analysis of the proposition and showed that it didn't hold up. And I believe that would be the case because, again, we're dealing with epistemology. What seems intuitively for Erik to be reasonable doesn't seem that way to other people. But he assumes he's right, and what they assume is intuitive and reasonable to them, he says is wrong.
Right.
But you can't have it both ways.
Okay, we got another caller here on the line. Hello.
Hello, this is Zor from the chat room. I have more of comments than questions about, earlier, I tuned in a later show, so if this has already been covered, stop me. As far as commenting on animal morals, I'm not a biologist by any means or anything like that. I'm actually an astrophysics major, but I have read enough literature to know that there have been certain groups of animals that have demonstrated morality and social order and reasoning ability. They've been able to teach certain species of chimpanzee sign language and things of that nature. And in the wild, they do seem to develop codes of conduct. And I think that has arisen as a form of cooperation, because in cooperation you can actually prosper more than you can in just direct competition, like some of the other lower species do. So I guess I'd like to have those guys comment further on that with in light of this knowledge.
Okay, all right, thank you. Erik?
Okay, so, what is it, is there a question exactly, or just my thoughts on this phenomenon?
Yeah, just the thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, as I said before, this is really a scientific question. And, I mean, if it turns out that, there are higher animals who, seem to be grasping these moral truths, okay. I mean, as I say before, it just depends on the kind of brain that you've got and whether you can do certain kinds of reasoning and abstract thinking. And I think it's, an open question, a question that's being investigated as to what extent, non-human animals have brains of that sort. And so, again, I mean, if it turns out that they do, it's okay.
I mean, I would think
they've got the right kind of brain for it.
Yeah, I would think that proves that it's a physical thing, however, myself. Bob?
Well, I've had a lecture on dealing with the issue of animal rights and responsibilities, and the field is so fraught with anthropomorphisms where we're reading human characteristics and applying them onto animals, and usually it's Western concepts that we're doing. Nothing definite can really be said. The main point is this: if man is nothing more than an animal, he may have less hair, he's a primate, he walks on 2 feet. If all he is an animal, and he's not to be in any way separated from the cosmic machine, we're part of the clogs of the machine, then the question of morals for animals includes man. And I don't see how, beginning with the premise that we're all animals, you end up with morality only for human beings, because an animal is an animal. And I think Bertrand Russell, with his vision of the world, put it correctly. Man is an accident, meaningless accident in a backwater. Well, if we're an accident, again, back to matter, chance, and time, and it was just dumb luck that somehow we evolved, the question of morality no longer is pertinent or relevant.
We have another caller just called in. Hello.
Hi, is this me?
You're on? I guess so. Is it?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Just kidding. Go ahead.
Hi. So my question is for Mr. Wielenberg. You mentioned before that a square necessarily has four corners and that a circle has no corners. So my question is, because we can't argue with that, how would you define what is moral or not?
Very good question. Thank you. Is that it? That's it?
Yes.
Thank you. I was thinking about that earlier. Eric?
Yeah, so the question, what is moral? Well, I mean, this is a huge question, right? Can we come up with some fundamental principle of morality that's going to tell us what our obligation is in every single, imaginable circumstance? No, look, I mean, I don't have any theory like that I'm, willing to hang my hat on. There have been various attempts throughout the history of philosophy. They all the ones I'm aware of, seem to have some problem. But here's a point I would emphasize. You don't have to be a moral philosopher or have an overarching theory of right and wrong to see that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. In fact, if the way these theories get tested is by comparing them with easy cases. So if you have a theory that implies that it is permissible to torture the innocent just for fun, to go back to my favorite example, that suggests your theory has gone haywire somewhere. So the short answer to the question is I don't have some theory to that effect. But, people go through their lives recognizing right and wrong without having any such theory. And you don't need the theory to recognize these obvious moral truths. Just like you don't need a theory of chairs, you don't have to be able to give some philosophically adequate definition of a chair to recognize a chair when you see it. There's my answer.
Bob?
All right. I
Bob,
think the question is good because it spells the difference between empirical knowledge based on measurement. You simply take out a ruler, you draw a circle and you draw a square, and you deduce from these empirically present, visible objects definitions. But this is what I meant by categorical fallacy. To go from something that is empirically visible, you can look at it, you can measure it, and then to talk about non-measurable, ethereal moral absolutes floating in the stratosphere that give no mental picture, none. I mean, when I say the word square, we all think square because we've seen one, we've drawn one. When you have humility, who in the world has a picture of that? It doesn't work. So a categorical fallacy simply means you're going from one thing to another that really they're not related. And this just underscores the problem. When you try to get ought out of is, you'll never get it. If we're only animals, if all there is simply matter, chance, and time, what you begin with is what you end with.
Okay. Are we going to take care of this last call, and then we'll do the final comments? Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, this is Jared, a.k.a. Aquashix from the chat room.
How you doing?
And I've got a comment for Bob and actually a quick question so that I can make the comment. And I was going to say, Bob, can you briefly restate and maybe clarify your comment about the triangles having parallel sides earlier and how this is a problem for logic?
If you get non-Euclidean geometry, have you studied Einstein's model of the universe being a sphere in which there is no such thing as a straight line, but all lines actually are bent? Have you studied that?
I'm a mathematics graduate student, and I've taken several classes that covered non-Euclidean geometry.
Okay, well then, sides of a triangle ultimately are parallel. Parallel lines ultimately intersect. This is what I was taught at university when I was in 10th grade.
Yeah, sure, if you have a positive curved space, sure.
Right, and the old model, which said the exact opposite. Sides of a triangle are never parallel. That was an absolute to them.
Sure.
Well, we found out that absolute is dependent upon the worldview. If you change the worldview, you now change the situation, and now sides of a triangle can be parallel.
Okay,
and then
your
those
problem
have superseded Einstein.
Change?
So when you deal with modern science, and you particularly get into the dancing Woolley masters, and you get into higher physics, you immediately are no longer even following Einstein. So what I simply meant was that when someone appeals to what Christian people, a Christian audience, even post-Christian, but a Christianized audience, that's what we have here in the United States. If you appeal to a Christian audience, certain argumentum ad miserum, where you appeal to misery, you appeal to hope or to love. We should love everybody. Well, the heads will start wagging like little dogs on springs in the back of the car. But when you speak to a different culture, a different worldview, what was taken in your culture as an absolute is no longer accepted because it isn't an absolute to them. So I was just pointing out, given the parameters of the kind of universe in which we're operating, and this was a godless universe, it ends up everything is relative, including science.
Okay, well, let me go ahead and make my comment about the triangles and non-Euclidean geometry.
Sure.
Non-Euclidean geometry and Euclidean geometry are both, well, non-Euclidean geometry is a very general term, but that aside, both of these things are axiomatizable, and they can both be placed side by side into a logical system, like take Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, for instance. You can embed both of these things quite harmoniously. They don't contradict each other. They are simply referring to different contexts. A triangle on a sphere or a triangle in hyperbolic space is not the same sort of object as a triangle in flat Euclidean space.
Exactly. That's
my
point.
But I think that doesn't prove your point, though, because these things are both consistent right now. It's not like we've changed our worldview. We're merely noting that these things are not, like Euclidean geometry is not the only option, but it's still logically internally consistent, and so is non-Euclidean geometry.
Aren't these models?
Everybody's worldview to achieve this.
Yeah, aren't they called scientific models?
This is mathematics. It has nothing to do with science necessarily. Einstein has used non-Euclidean geometry for relativity theory, but it has nothing to do with science.
Well, these are models, are they not?
What?
And when we're discussing worldviews and Einstein and Newton, and we're discussing quantum mechanics, and these are scientific models that come and go. Now, they may work. You can get to the moon using Newton or Einstein, either way. But when you're discussing in the philosophy of science, and that's where I've lectured, that there are different models of the universe, scientifically speaking, that do not, in any sense, correspond to each other. I mean, when I was first as a little kid, they taught me that every molecule had electrons and neutrons. We used to take those little wooden, what were they, tiddlywinks or whatever they were, little round little sticks, and make the... Then I learned all of that was not true. Not true at all.
Right.
It was a model. That's all. It was a model.
Hey, Jerry, can you go ahead and wrap up your point? And Jerry, can you quickly wrap up your point and then direct your next question? I think you have one for Erik. Okay.
Sure. What I wanted to say to this is basically that I don't think it's a fair analogy with the triangles, because that's mathematics, and that's internally logically consistent, and it can never be overthrown. But when you try to draw an analogy between that and science, you're kind of going off the rails here, because like Newton and Einstein and quantum mechanics, these things all contradict each other, but we still hold them as being valid because they operate at different scales in different contexts. That is not the case, really, in that sense in mathematics. So I think if you're going to draw an analogy to morals, it would probably be like if you take, you shouldn't kill people. It's by default bad to kill people unless you have some kind of superseding reason not to. And I'll take that response off the air. Bye.
Well, we agree. You said everything that I said. It's a different context, different worldview, different model. That's exactly what I was saying.
Do you want to respond to that at all, Erik?
Well, I think the point of the math analogy, I mean, look, clearly there are important differences between truth in mathematics and truth in morals. I guess the point is simply there are some things that we can see to be true simply by thinking about them. And, I mean, again, let's put aside the math and let's just focus on morality. I mean, I know there's this sense that some people seem to have the sense that when it comes to morality, you've got to somehow deduce it from, descriptive facts about the world, or you're not allowed to assume any moral facts. But, Bob and I have agreed, at least on this much, that you can't get an ought from an is. So if this demand or this request that moral truths be derived from some other kind of truth is unanswerable. Moral truths are a fundamentally different kind of truth. So my point is simply this, and I mean, again, I think this is sort of independent of my position about the origin of the truth. I think this would, if you've got a theistic universe, the same thing would be true. It's perfectly reasonable to take something like it's morally wrong to torture the innocent just for fun as a starting point, as an assumption. It's self-evident. It doesn't need to be proven. And so if there's going to be morality at all, you're going to have moral axioms of that sort. And the request or the demand that they be deduced from some other kind of truth, why think that it has to be that way? It's perfectly reasonable just to start with self-evident moral truths.
All right, yeah, I forgot that we were going to, I forgot we started just a little bit later, so I'm just going to take this one last phone call, and then we'll do the closing statements. Hopefully this will be a quick and easy question and answer here. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, am I on me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. This question is for Bob. Hi, Bob. I have a question. Is it morally okay for me, a human being, to kill a baby for the crimes of his ancestors?
Speaking in a godless universe, you can do whatever you want, and that's what we do.
Sorry, I'm asking
and all throughout the world, that action is done, and it's justified by people who have no guilt, and they think it is intuitively right.
Bob,
they feel it's reasonable.
I'm not asking from my viewpoint. I'm asking about from your theology. Can you tell me theologically, is it okay for me as a human being to kill a baby for the crimes of his ancestors?
In other words, do I believe in abortion?
No,
a couple
theology can handle it.
Fornicate, commit immorality, we should kill the baby.
That was a good response.
Now you know how I feel, caller.
Bob. Is it
I don't know what you mean. You have to explain what you mean.
Well, you're just refusing to answer questions and pretending.
I'm not sure what he means by that.
Bob, if you have some moral absolutes to hang on to, I would like to know, is it morally permissible for me as a human being to kill a baby for the crimes of his ancestors? Just tell me yes or no.
Oh, you're saying with my worldview, not a godless worldview.
That's right, yes.
But in the biblical, well, that's a different debate. I'm willing to come back on the program and debate that issue, but the thesis is very simple. In a godless universe, and I'm not going to follow these red herrings, I'm more than willing to discuss my view of evil and God and morality and things of that nature. That's fine. But that is not pertinent to the issue at hand, which is, as the book beautifully puts, value and virtue in a godless universe.
Well,
what I believe is no relevance.
It was pertinent to a comment made about relativism, supposedly, of the secular ethics, because if it's not okay for me as a human being to kill a baby based on the crimes of his ancestors, but it's okay for God to kill a baby or have babies killed for the crimes of their ancestors, then it would be you who has the relativistic system. Me, I would say that it's wrong to kill a baby for the crimes of ancestors at any time by any actor.
Well, that's nice. I mean, in a world of without meaning, you can choose to believe whatever you want to believe.
Okay, so fair enough. You don't want to defend your point, so
I'm not arguing for theism in this debate. Where did I ever argue for theism? Never. I've never brought it up. I never brought up God.
Well,
Eric brought up God. I'm talking in the context of a godless universe. I'm in the shoes that I used to wear of Mr. Atheist.
Thanks for the call.
I'm speaking from the perspective of being a secular humanist looking at the issue at a fellow humanist who is attempting to generate some absolute morals, and I don't think he can do it.
Okay,
so
Eric,
if you want another debate another time, that's fine. But it's irrelevant
he's hung up now.
Debate.
Eric, you have any comments on that? And if not, we can go ahead and close at this point.
I think I'm ready. I guess I don't have any thoughts about that. I mean, well, I've said before. I mean, I think the notion that we we can't talk about God because of the proposition of the debate, has no basis. But I have nothing to add to that. So I'm ready to close.
Okay. You have up to 10 minutes, but I'm pretty sure it won't take that long.
All right. So I start. So I just want to touch on two things. One that came up in the question and answer session there. By the way, you've got a sharp audience. I'm glad I didn't have to take the one about Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometry. But I wanted to touch on something that Bob mentioned. There's a kind of argument that I think he mentioned twice, or at least once, which is without God in a godless universe, humans would just be animals, and so they would have no morality or, I guess, any rights or obligations or anything of that sort. This, I think, is a remarkably bad argument. The category of animals is extremely broad and covers, creatures with all sorts of different properties. It's sort of like saying, well, without God, humans are just animals. Animals live outside, and so humans must live outside. Conclusion clearly doesn't follow. But in the particular case of morals, we can see that different types of creatures have different features, and some of these features make a moral difference. And you can see this even with putting aside humans altogether and just focusing on non-human animals. There are things that it's permissible to do to a fly that it's totally unpermissible to do to a monkey or a dog. All day I've had this fly buzzing around my house, and it's not causing any particular harm. It's just slightly annoying. Seems to me perfectly permissible to smash it, crush it with a magazine or something. If I had a dog in here and I found the dog annoying, the idea that it would be permissible for me to crush it with a giant block or something like that is ridiculous. And the reason for this is that there are important differences between dogs and flies. In particular, their mental capacities are quite different. Dogs can suffer and feel emotions and engage in much more complex and higher mental processes than a fly can. And these differences make a moral difference. And so when you go to the case of humans, there are going to be things that you shouldn't do to humans. Humans have certain rights and obligations because of their other properties and the way that they differ from the other animals. So the fact that humans are in this broad category animals in no way implies that, without God, they can be treated in any old way. So this is, it's an argument I'm glad to have the chance to comment on. The second thing, this will be, the last point I'll make. This point about intuition and things being self-evident. Suppose I were just to come along and say, okay, the theist thinks there's this perfect God, and the existence of that God seems obvious to him. Well, I think there is no God, and there are these moral truths, and they seem self-evident to me, and so you should believe my view rather than the theistic view. This would be ridiculous. This would be unconvincing. This would be very disappointing. That's not what I do. That's not what I do at all. And so again, the general strategy that I use in my opening comments and that I use in the book is this: when we reflect on what would follow from the supposition that God has ultimate control over morality, it leads to unacceptable consequences. It leads to consequences that are unacceptable for anyone. For instance, that might makes right. And it also leads to consequences that the theist is not going to be able to accept. This is the point of my second argument. If God can control or adjust morality in any old way, there's simply no possible excuse for the presence of evil. Typically, people try to explain evil by saying, well, God wanted this great good, and he couldn't get it unless he let in this other evil. But that assumes that God can't just reassign or control the moral facts as he sees fit, because if he could make something else a great good, which didn't require evil, and he would get that thing and have a great world without any evil. So even the theist should see that the idea that God has ultimate control of morality leads to big trouble, specifically for him. These are the arguments I was trying to make at the beginning, which Bob has just decided to ignore. These are the arguments that I make in the book, and I discuss in the greater length. So, I encourage the audience to, if they're interested, take a look there. It's not just, I think there are moral truths instead of God. There are these arguments. And also they can, read for themselves my views on the role of luck and chance and so on. And with that, I think I'll close. Thanks, Reggie. Thanks, Bob, for coming on. Thanks to the callers. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Okay, Bob Morey.
I'd like to close with the words of Bertrand Russell, who, in addition to saying that man is an accident in a backwater, had this to say: that man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collusions of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the new day brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast depth of the solar universe system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. When he states that his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collisions of atoms, this includes the idea of morals, which he illustrated in his own life by a complete lack of them. In the end, there is matter, there is chance, and there is time. If all that is, that's it. That's all, folks, like Porky Pig would say. We live in a universe without meaning, without hope, without guidance, without destiny, without order. Our lives are but floating as jetsam and flotsam in a sea of meaningless despair. We are all drowning in the waters of relativism. We are only kidding ourselves that there is such a thing as morals. Mankind as such lives completely without them, ignores them, denies them, and if he says he believes in them, he rejects them. And when you put rubber to the road, they're always unreachable, never attainable, and it produces nothing but constant guilt. In a world that is without God, without hope, there is, in the words of Bertrand Russell, only unyielding despair. But then, as one graduate student said to me with a bright smile, if that's all there is, I embrace it and I will enjoy my despair. This is the world that you will end up with inevitably once you jettison out of the wagon any of the leftover ideas of theism, such as moral absolutes. This is the brave new world that must be embraced. If one casts off God, embrace the Grim Reaper, embrace hopelessness, embrace meaninglessness, and the absurdity of the universe. And that's all I have to say.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, Dr. Robert Morey and Erik Wielenberg, for debating with us on ethics without a God. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.